Okay, so we are going to be doing a little bit of review because in order to tackle that final logarithm equation, we have to know something about factoring. Okay, so before we tackle example 15, which is on factoring within logarithms, we must know how to factor. So example 13 and 14, we're going to be reviewing how to factor. Okay, now if you already know how to factor and find zeros, I would encourage you to go to the end of the video and see if you get the right answer. Okay, but if you don't remember how to do this from one of your previous math classes, I'll be going over that with you. Okay, so there are a lot of ways to factor. Okay, there are so many ways. I'm going to teach you the way I like to teach it. If you don't like this way and you have a better way, or your teacher you thought taught it to you a better way, you can still use that way. You do not have to use this method. Okay, so we're going to be finding zeros through factoring. Okay, now factoring occurs when we have a highest exponent of 2. Okay, and so we must have a quadratic in order to use factoring. Okay, so first of all, when we factor, we must be in standard form, which is the standard form. Okay, so you need to write your exponents in descending order, which means you start with the highest exponent and go down by 1 each time. And this side must always equal 0. It must always be 0 before you start to factor. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through the steps as I work the problem because I think it would make more sense if you see me as I do it. So before we start factoring and finding our zeros, the first thing I like to do is determine our A, B, and C. That way we already know what they are and we don't have to question it. Alright, so my A is the number in front of the x squared, which I don't see a number in front of my x squared, so secretly there's a 1 in front of my x squared. Okay, so my A value is going to be a 1. My B value is the number in front of x, which look there. There's a number in front of x, and that number is 7. So my B value is 7, and then my final value, the C, is the one without the x. So the term that does not have the x is a 10. Okay, because I'm going to be referring to the A, B, and C in the problem, so it's good to know what those are at the start. Okay, so the technique I'm going to teach you is called slide and divide. Okay, so we're going to do the slide part first. So slide. The slide part, you slide the A to the C and you multiply them. Okay, so my A is 1 and my C is 10, so my slide would be 1 times 10, which is 10. Okay, so that's my slide. Okay, and this is my AC. So my A times my C is the slide. So I'm going to write A times C. That's my slide. Okay, now the divide we do kind of toward the end. So I'm going to do the divide down here. Okay, even though we don't do the divide until the very end, I encourage you to do it right away so you don't forget about it. So at the very end, we're going to have 2 parentheses with x's in them. Alright, and we will be adding or subtracting values to our x's. So our final answer will look like this. And eventually, whatever we get in here, we're going to be writing in our parentheses. And we're going to be dividing those numbers by the A value. Okay, so whatever we get in here, we will eventually divide them by A. So we slid A over and we slid it to the C value. So the slide was 1 times 10. And then we're going to divide by the A value. So you slide and divide the A value. So eventually we're going to be dividing by 1. Okay, so we're going to put this part on hold. We're going to wait till that's done. Okay, so we multiply the A times C, which is the slide. Okay, and at the end we're going to divide by the A. So this is the divide. Next step, we must find 2 numbers that both multiply to be A times C and add to be B. They must be the same numbers. Okay, you can't just pick 2 random numbers that multiply to be AC and 2 things that add to be B. They have to be the same exact numbers. Okay, so I'm going to set that part up. So we need to find 2 nifty numbers that multiply to equal our slide, which our slide was A times C, which is 10. So this is our AC. And add to be B. Okay, so we already know the A times C because that was the slide part. Okay, the B value, which we already found, was 7. So we're trying to find 2 numbers that both multiply to be 10 and add to be 7. Holy hot dog, you guys are so smart. You already knew that those numbers are 2 and 5. These numbers multiply to be 10 and add to be 7. Okay, so these numbers, you guys, are the ones we put in our parenthesis. Okay, and since they're both positive numbers, we will be adding in our parenthesis. If any of these were negative, we would be subtracting in our parenthesis. So I'm going to bring down my positive 2 and my positive 5. So we're going to add the 2 and the 5. Okay, so that's the next step. So we found our numbers that multiply to be a times c and add to be b. We put those numbers in a parenthesis and we added or subtracted them to our x, which in this case we added. Okay, and then the next step, okay, if we have a fraction, we need to reduce it down. And if we end up with a fraction, we have to do something about the denominator. But let's see what happens. So I'm going to reduce these down. So let's see what we're left with. X plus 2 divided by 1, well, that's just 2. And x plus 5 divided by 1, well, 5 divided by 1 is 5. Okay, I did not end up with a fraction. If I did end up with a fraction, we'd have to move, like if this number couldn't divide evenly, what you do is move these to the very front, which technically I did that. If you move to the front 1 to the front of the x, we have a 1x and you're left with the 2. So if you end up with a fraction after you reduce them down, okay, you move your denominator to the front, in front of your x, and you leave whatever was in the numerator, which we technically did. 1 moved to the front, this is technically 1x, and the 2 was left over. Okay, so that part is the factoring part. So we have conquered the factoring part. Guys, so these are the steps for slide and divide. They are not included in your notes. Okay, so if you'd like to copy this down, go ahead and pause the video right now and copy those down. Okay, but now we're going to talk about how we find the zeros from here. So, okay, currently we have two numbers that multiply to equal 0. Okay, so if two things have to multiply to be 0, that means at least one of my parentheses must be 0. Because anything times 0 is 0. Or they both could be 0. I don't know. So the way we find our zeros is through something called the zero product property, which states if you have two things that multiply to be 0, then at least one or both of them have to be 0. So when we solve, we're going to say each parenthesis equal to 0 because they have the possibility of equaling 0. Okay, so I'm going to set my x plus 2 equal to 0 and my x plus 5 equal to 0. Either of these could equal 0 and multiply to get 0. Okay, and then after that, we just solve that bad boy for x, and then we're done. Okay, so when I'm solving, to move positive 2 to the other side, we're going to do the opposite of that, which is subtracting it on both sides. Okay, which 2 minus 2 subtracts and cancels out to be 0. 0 minus 2 is negative 2. So one of my answers is x equals negative 2. Bam. So that's 1. Okay, or same thing on the other side. I'm going to bring my 5 to the other side. Okay, which to bring a positive 5 to the other side, you subtract that bad boy on both sides. 5 minus 5 gives me 0, cancels out. And 0 minus 5 is negative 5. Okay, so my other answer would be x equals negative 5. And that's it, you guys. So we did our slide, our divide, we factored, and then we set each factor equal to 0. Okay, so hopefully that was kind of a review from your previous math classes. Problem 14 is very similar, but there's one extra step in there because we said standard form has to equal 0. So we have to make sure that this right here equals 0. Again, if you think you kind of understand the process and you'd like to try it on your own, go ahead and pause the video and fast forward to the end and see if you get it right. Alright guys, so our first step. First of all, it must be in standard form. So this must equal 0. Holy hot dog, that does not equal 0. So we need to move the 12 to the other side. Okay, so since it's a positive 12, when we move it to the other side, we'll be subtracting 12. Okay, which 12 minus 12 will give me the 0. And I can't subtract 12 from any of these numbers. It's not a like term. Okay, so that's just going to be kind of tacked on behind the 5x. So currently my equation is 2x squared minus 5x, and then minus my 12, because I have nothing to combine the 12 to. And it will equal 0. Okay, so we had one little extra step in there, but from here, we're going to proceed like we just did. Okay, so first thing, let's determine what the A, B, and C are. Okay, so A is the number in front of the x squared. Okay, so the number in front of my x squared, holy hot dog, it's right there. It's a 2. Okay, the number in front of my b, or my b value, is the number in front of my x, which is a negative 5. And the c is always the number without the x, which is negative 12. Alright guys, so since I know my a, b, and c, let's start sliding and dividing. So we're going to slide the 2 to the negative 12, the a to the c. Okay, so this is a times c, my slide. So we slide the a over, so my slide will be 2 times negative 12, which is negative 24. Okay, so this is our a times our c. So we slide a over, okay, which I don't want to confuse you with this, so we technically slide a over, and when it gets there, we do a times c. Maybe that will make more sense. So you slide a, and then you multiply it to the c. Okay, and then after you slide, you will divide. So we're going to set this up so we don't forget. So this answer, okay, we'll have 2 parentheses with an x, and eventually we're going to divide by whatever we slid over. So since we slid over the 2, we'll be dividing by 2. Slide and divide. Okay, now I need to figure out what numbers go in my parenthesis. So that's when we find our 2 numbers that multiply to be a times c, which we already know that. It's negative 24 is our a times c. That's our slide. Okay, and then we need to find 2 numbers that add to be b, which we said our b was negative 5. So let's think about this. We need 2 numbers that both multiply to be negative 24 and add to be negative 5. Holy hot dog, you guys are so smart. You already knew it was negative 8 and positive 3. Sorry. I thought it, but wrote the wrong thing down. Negative 8 and positive 3. Negative 8 times 3 is negative 24, and negative 8 plus 3 is negative 5. Okay? So these are always the numbers that you put in your parentheses. Since I have a negative 8, this one's going to be minus 8. Okay, and since I have a 3, a positive 3, this would be plus 3. Okay, so now what we currently have, what we do after this, we have to reduce down our fractions, okay? So next step, we've already done all this stuff. So next step, we have to we have to reduce our fractions, and then if we have a denominator, we'll have to move it somewhere else, which this one will. So prepare yourself for that. Okay. So I have x minus 8 divided by 2 is 4. Okay, and I can't reduce this fraction down anymore. It's just 3/2, which 3 over 2 doesn't reduce down. Okay, so since it won't reduce down and we don't like fractions in factored form, what we have to do is move this 2 to the front of my x. Okay, so this is going to be 2, the 2 moves into the front, 2 times x, and then you're just left with the plus 3. Okay, so again, I just move my denominator to the front and left this number there. That's how you deal with something if you have a fraction and it does not reduce down. And then from here, you guys, we just solve for x. We find the 0. So we do that by setting each parenthesis equal to 0. So I'm going to have x minus 4 equals 0. And I'm going to have 2x plus 3 equals 0. And I'm just going to solve this bad boy for x. So I'm going to add my negative 4 to the other side, since a positive 4 is the opposite of that. So I'm left with 4. So one of my answers is going to be x equals 4. Sorry guys, I know I'm running out of room. So this will be x equals 4. Or on this side, we have to subtract 3 from both sides. Which 3 minus 3 cancels, turns to 0. 0 minus 3 is negative 3. So we have to do a little bit more work on this one. So now we have 2x equals negative 3. Okay, and we got to get x by itself, so we're going to move that 2 to the other side, which the 2 is secretly multiplying to the x. So the way we move that to the other side is by dividing. So we'll divide both sides by 2. Okay, which the 2's, 2 divided by 2 is 1. So the 2's cancel out and turn to 1. So we're left with x equals, which x is the same thing as 1x. And from here, I can't reduce down negative 3/2. So this one would just be negative 3/2. So these are my 2 possible solutions. All right, so hopefully you remember some of that from your previous math class, but if not, I hope you had a fun time learning how to factor and find zeros using the slide and divide technique.